why you're always blamed. You weren't loud. You were just louder than the silence they were used to. You weren't too sensitive. You were just finally responding to what you always felt but were trained to ignore. There's a moment, subtle, piercing, where you start to realize you've been cast as the villain in a story you didn't write. They say you overreact, that you're too much, that you need to calm down. But inside, you feel something deeper. Not rage, not confusion, something sharper. Clarity. Because what they call overreacting might be you finally waking up. They say you're the problem. But have you ever stopped to ask, what if you're not the problem? What if you're the mirror? The more emotionally aware you become, the more uncomfortable you make those who are not. Because you reflect back things they don't want to feel, truths they've buried, pain they've denied, patterns they've protected for years under a mask of "I'm fine." And you disturb that, not because you want to, but because you can't help but feel what's real. You hold up a mirror without meaning to, and when people look into it, they don't see your love, your compassion, your softness. They see their own unhealed pain. And pain doesn't like to be seen. It lashes out. It points the finger. It calls the mirror dangerous. It calls the mirror unstable. It calls the mirror the problem. But let's be clear. The mirror didn't create the cracks. It only revealed them. This is why you've been misunderstood for so long. You've been absorbing reactions that never belonged to you. You've been carrying projections that were born from someone else's fear, someone else's denial. They weren't reacting to who you are. They were reacting to what you represented. Because when a person can't face themselves, they will attack anyone who reminds them of who they're pretending not to be. And that's what you've been. A reminder, a disruption, a mirror. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But most people don't want understanding. They want comfort. And truth is never comfortable. You spoke with depth. You felt too much. You noticed what they tried to bury. And instead of thanking you, they punished you for it. You became too intense, too emotional, too complicated, too hard to love. But none of that was about you. It was about them, and the parts of themselves they refused to see. You weren't unstable. You were just aware. And awareness, in a world built on denial, is threatening. Let's go deeper. Let's talk about why this pattern keeps repeating in your life. Why do you keep attracting people who seem drawn to your light, but then turn on you when things get too real? Why are you always the one doing the emotional labor, the one apologizing for feeling too much, the one holding space for others while no one holds it for you? Why are you always the problem? Because somewhere along the way, you learned that if you could just be good enough, calm enough, wise enough, you could keep the peace. You thought your empathy would heal them. You thought your love would convince them. You thought if you just made yourself smaller, quieter, easier to love, they'd stop hurting. But you weren't wrong for loving deeply. You weren't wrong for wanting connection. You just didn't realize. They weren't rejecting you. They were rejecting the part of themselves your love exposed. There are people who cannot handle the weight of truth, not because truth is cruel, but because truth requires them to change. And some people would rather destroy the mirror than change what they see in it. You've been blamed. You've been shamed. You've been told that your reactions are the problem. But maybe your reactions were never too much. Maybe they were the first honest response to a dishonest environment. Maybe your voice was the first real sound in a room full of emotional silence. You didn't make them abandon themselves. They already had. You just happened to be the one who reminded them of it. The psychology behind projection and self-abandonment. You've been carrying the emotional weight of people who never learned how to carry themselves. You've been the safe place for people who have never felt safe within their own minds. And somehow, when they start falling apart inside, they blame you for the collapse. Why? Because emotionally unavailable people often live in deep contradiction. They crave connection, but fear exposure. They want intimacy, but panic at vulnerability. They want to be loved, but resist being truly seen. And when you come into their life, you don't just offer love, you offer clarity. You bring a mirror. You become the reflection of everything they've avoided for years. Not by force, not by aggression, but by presence. You feel what's not being said. You name the thing behind the smile. You sense the child behind the coldness. And suddenly, they're no longer in control of the narrative they've built to protect themselves. That's when the projection begins. The shadow and the false self. Carl Jung called it the shadow. All the parts of the psyche that a person represses, disowns, or denies. Shame, anger, neediness, fear, longing. Everything they've decided is bad or weak. Everything that threatens their image. They push it down, and instead of processing it, they project it. They say you're the angry one. They say you're the needy one. They say you're the one who can't be trusted, who's unstable, who's overreacting. Because in their mind, if the chaos is yours, they don't have to face their own. It's a defense mechanism. But to the receiver, to you, it's emotional violence dressed up as misunderstanding. And still, you try to understand them. Because your empathy makes you look inward. Maybe I am too much. Maybe I should be more patient. Maybe I should stop feeling so deeply. But let me say this clearly. You are not responsible for someone else's refusal to confront their own pain. You cannot rescue a person from a battle they've chosen not to fight. And if they've abandoned themselves, they will abandon you too. The psychology of self-abandonment. People don't just wake up one day disconnected from their emotions. They were taught, either directly or through experience, that their feelings weren't safe. Maybe they were raised in a home where vulnerability was mocked, where anger was punished, where sadness was ignored, where silence meant safety. So they learned to split from themselves, to disown their emotional truth in order to belong, to become who they needed to be at the cost of who they truly were. And now they walk through life armored up, performing strength, performing indifference, performing control. But the more they perform, the more disconnected they become. They've abandoned their emotional inner child, the part of them that still aches, the part that still wants to be held, seen, loved without condition. But instead of turning inward to do the work, they turn outward and find someone like you, someone who can see them, someone who feels deeply, someone who brings warmth to their emotional winter. And for a moment, it feels like healing, but only for a moment, because the moment you get too close, the moment your presence starts melting the armor, their survival instinct kicks in. They run, they attack, they gaslight, they project. They will do anything to protect the mask they wear, because they believe that if they take it off, they'll be rejected all over again. So they reject you first, to stay safe, to stay hidden, to stay in control. Why you became their mirror. There's a reason they were drawn to you in the first place. It wasn't random. Your empathy, your emotional depth, your ability to hold what they could never hold for themselves. That's what attracted them. That's what made them feel seen. But that's also what made them run. Because love that sees too much feels dangerous to someone who hasn't made peace with their own reflection. To be loved fully requires being seen fully. And not everyone is ready for that. They said you were too intense. But what they meant was, you saw too much. They said you were overwhelming. But what they meant was, your love uncovered what I've hidden for years. They said you were unstable. But what they meant was, your truth shook the lies I've built my identity on. And what about you? What happens to the mirror when it's blamed for the cracks it reveals? You've likely internalized their reactions as personal failures. You've overanalyzed your tone. You've questioned your motives. You've begged yourself to just stop caring so much. But your sensitivity isn't the problem. It's the evidence that you're still in touch with your soul. You weren't unstable. You were emotionally intelligent in a relationship with someone emotionally avoidant. And that gap, that chasm, is what caused the pain. Not your truth, not your clarity, not your presence. The problem wasn't that you felt too much. It was that they felt nothing and needed you to do the feeling for both of you. You became the container. You held space. You held pain. You held silence. But who held you? You didn't break them. You just showed them they were already broken. You didn't push them away. You just refused to keep shrinking so they could stay comfortable. They abandoned themselves a long time ago. All you did was remind them of what they left behind. And that is why you became the problem. The emotional fallout, living in the aftermath of projection. You don't really notice the damage all at once. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It shows up in the quiet moments. In the pause between texts. In the moment your chest tightens when someone says, "We need to talk." In the subtle fear that you're too much for everyone, always. That's the emotional fallout of being made the problem for simply being the mirror. You didn't start the fire, but now you're the one left with the burn marks. The hardest part isn't losing them. It's losing the version of yourself you became just to survive their love. The slow ache of emotional starvation. Let's talk about it. The hollow feeling you carried long before they ever walked away. It starts as confusion. They pull away slowly. They respond with less warmth. Their words become shorter. Their eyes don't light up the same. But there's no fight, no closure, no explanation, just a gradual retreat. And you, trying harder. You try to be easier to love. You over-explain yourself. You suppress your needs. You study their moods like a language you were never taught. You carry the weight of their silence like it's your responsibility to fix it. But nothing works. Because the more you give, the more they disappear. Not because you weren't enough, but because they were never able to receive that much truth in the first place. When your love is too intimate for their wounds. Here's a paradox. You offered them everything you hoped someone would offer you. Safety, clarity, emotional depth. You thought love would heal them. But love, real love, felt like exposure. Because when someone hasn't faced their own pain, your honesty becomes confrontation. Your openness becomes a threat. Your clarity becomes criticism. And your empathy becomes a mirror too terrifying to look into. So they lash out, or shut down, or disappear, leaving you to question your own reality. And here's where the real injury happens. Not just in the rejection, but in the reversal. They frame you as the unstable one, the dramatic one, the emotional one, the one who ruined everything. And when you're sensitive and introspective, that kind of framing cuts deep. You believe it. You internalize it. You start to rewrite your own story to fit their inability to feel. That's not heartbreak. That's psychological warfare. The silent grief you don't know how to name. You mourn people who are still alive. That's what this feels like. You miss the version of them that could have existed. The potential of what you could have been together. The intimacy you were almost able to build before they ran from it. And even more than that, you miss yourself. You miss the version of you that was soft, before the overthinking, before the shame, before you felt like your very being was too much. You start asking questions that don't heal. What could I have done differently? Was I really that difficult to love? Why do I always end up the one who feels more? But here's the truth. You weren't the only one who felt more. You were just the only one who stayed with your feelings. They felt it too. They just buried it deeper. And when they saw you living emotionally alive, it made them confront how emotionally numb they've become. So they ran, but not because you were wrong. They ran because you were real. Why empaths are drawn to emotionally avoidant people. Let's dig deeper. You're not weak for loving hard. You're not broken for caring. But you may be wounded in a way that makes you tolerate emotional starvation longer than you should. You see, many empaths come from environments where love was conditional, where they were rewarded for staying silent, where peace meant suppressing themselves. So when you meet someone who gives just enough warmth to hope, but never enough to feel safe, it's familiar. It feels like home. But home was never safe to begin with. And so begins the cycle. You try harder. You show up more. You read between the lines. You forgive too quickly. You wait for the moment they finally love you back the way you deserve. But deep down, you know that moment may never come. Still you stay? Not because you're naive, but because you believe in people. Because you know what it's like to be misunderstood. Because you've always hoped your love could be enough. But let me say this clearly. Love can't heal someone who's committed to staying disconnected. And your worth should never be measured by how long you're willing to bleed for someone who keeps handing you the knife. The cost of overextending yourself. You don't just lose your time. You lose your identity. You start to silence your intuition. You over-rationalize their behavior. You gaslight yourself before they even have to. You stop asking for what you need. You start saying it's fine when it isn't. You become an expert at managing their discomfort and a stranger to your own. But here's the most painful cost. You begin to distrust your own heart. You start to believe that maybe love is too dangerous. Maybe you should stop caring. Maybe next time, you should be colder, harder, more distant. But please, don't let their fear of depth turn you into someone shallow. Your love didn't fail. It simply arrived in a place where it couldn't be received. Not because you were wrong, but because they were still at war with themselves. The moment you begin to wake up, there's a moment, subtle but powerful, when you start to reclaim yourself. Maybe it's after you realized you've been mourning someone who was never emotionally available to begin with. Maybe it's the silence that no longer hurts, but starts to feel peaceful. Maybe it's the day you no longer feel like begging. You stop chasing. You stop fixing. You stop explaining your worth to someone who never learned how to see value in their own soul. And for the first time in a long time, you feel clear. Not angry, not bitter, just clear, because the fog of their projections is starting to lift, and the light returning isn't theirs, it's yours. You're not healing from a relationship, you're healing from a distortion of reality, from being told your feelings were wrong, from being trained to disconnect from yourself to stay connected to someone else. You're not just recovering love. You're recovering clarity, and the moment that clarity becomes your compass, everything begins to change. Not because they apologized, not because they returned, but because you did. You returned to the self they made you abandon. And that is the beginning of your power, the truth that sets you free. There comes a moment in your healing when you stop trying to be understood by those who were committed to misunderstanding you. Not out of bitterness, but from clarity, because you finally realize you were never the problem. You were just the mirror, and the reflection you gave them was too honest, too raw, too real. But now, you're no longer adjusting your light to make someone else comfortable in their darkness. You've stopped shrinking yourself to fit the smallness of their emotional world. And in doing so, you begin to remember something they tried to make you forget: your wholeness. You were never too much. You were the reminder they avoided. It hits you one day, softly, but irreversibly. The things they criticized in you were the things they couldn't access in themselves. Your intensity, it threatened their numbness. Your self-awareness, it pierced through their denial. Your emotional depth, it highlighted their emotional avoidance. Your need for clarity, it exposed their chaos. They didn't leave because you were wrong. They left because you were real. And being around someone who is fully alive, when you're emotionally disconnected, feels like standing too close to the sun. But here's what they'll never admit: they respected you more than they let on. Because even in their withdrawal, they felt you. And even after they left, they kept trying to forget someone who only ever asked them to be honest. That's why silence follows you. Not because you were forgettable, but because you were unforgettable. And that kind of truth lingers. Reclaiming yourself is not retaliation, it's resurrection. There's something sacred about choosing yourself again, not as rebellion, not to prove anything, but because you finally see your worth was never up for debate. You stop fighting for someone to see you, because you see yourself now. You stop over-explaining, because you realize people who want to understand you will. And you stop proving your value, because value doesn't beg. You don't need them to validate your heart anymore, because you've remembered where it lives. And that's the paradox of healing. The moment you no longer need their love is the moment you finally understand what real love is. It doesn't demand that you fracture to be accepted. It doesn't shrink you. It doesn't guilt you for your truth. Real love meets you where you are, and it stays. But before that love arrives, you must become it for yourself. Not everyone is ready for real love, and that's not your responsibility. This part is hard, but it's necessary. Some people are drawn to you because they want the warmth you offer. But when they feel it, they panic, because that warmth shines light on everything they've buried. It's not your fault they weren't ready. It's not your job to prepare them. And it's not your calling to bleed for someone who refuses to bandage their own wounds. You cannot love someone out of self-abandonment. You cannot force someone to confront themselves. And you cannot make someone see your heart when they're still hiding from their own. So let them go, not in anger, not in resentment, but in deep, quiet knowing. You were never lost. They were never looking. You were never broken. They were never ready. And now that you are, you no longer need to be chosen. You've already chosen you. When the mirror turns inward, now that the mirror no longer reflects their projection, it begins to show you something else. Your own face, your own soul, your own patterns. You start asking the real questions. Why did I stay so long? Why did I tolerate emotional starvation? Why did I confuse suffering with intimacy? And these questions aren't punishments. They're portals. Because in asking them honestly, you start to unravel the roots. You begin to see how your history, your wounds, your longing, all shaped the person who believed love had to hurt. But now, you're not that person anymore. You're not surviving love. You're learning it. You're not begging for crumbs. You're learning how to feed yourself with your own truth. And the mirror no longer reflects just pain. It reflects growth, strength, clarity. You finally see yourself clearly, not through their lens, but through your own soul. You don't have to prove you deserve love. You just have to stop denying it. Here's the most liberating truth of all. You've always been lovable, even when they couldn't love you. Even when you questioned your worth, even when you twisted yourself into emotional origami just to stay connected. Your worth isn't fragile. It's not based on their ability to see you. It's not based on being picked. It's not based on being praised. It's based on being fully, unapologetically, truthfully, the version of you that you tried to mute to keep their love. That version was always the one most worthy of it. And now that you've returned to that self, the one with boundaries, with clarity, with depth, you no longer seek love that costs you your peace. This isn't the end, it's the becoming. Healing doesn't come with fireworks. It comes quietly, in small decisions, in long walks, in the texts you don't send, in the stories you stop rewriting. It comes when you start breathing easier, when your nervous system feels safe, when your reflection no longer looks like someone performing for love. You're not chasing, you're not fixing, you're not over-explaining. You're becoming. And this becoming isn't loud. It doesn't demand validation. It just is. You are here. You are whole. And you are no longer someone else's projection. You are your own presence, your own mirror, and finally, your own home. So here's the truth. If you were always the problem in their story, it's because your presence threatened the illusion they were still trying to protect. But now that you've stepped outside of that illusion, you see clearly, and that clarity is love, not the love you waited for, but the love you became. If this spoke to something deep in you, you're not alone. Leave a comment if this gave language to what you've been carrying in silence. Share it with someone who's still healing. And remember, you were never too much. You were never the problem. You were just the mirror. And now, you finally get to be the one looking back.